Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake. I'm your host, Brian DeAngelis, but on this week's episode, we're going global. Our Penta team in London recently hosted a conversation between Penta's Mark MacGregor and Thomas Watson. Thomas was a member of British Parliament from 2001 to 2019 and served as the deputy leader of the British Labour Party. Mark and Thomas have a discussion about the prospects of a change in the UK's government in 2024 and the priorities for what may be a new Labour government. Take a listen to this fascinating conversation about what's happening in the UK, and we'll be back next week with another episode of What's at Stake.
Well, good morning and welcome to the latest in our series of Penta political interviews about Britain's future, political and economic future. My name is Mark MacGregor and I'm chairing the event today. For today's event, I'm delighted to welcome my friend, former deputy leader of the Labour Party, Tom Watson, now having been elevated to the House of Lords, Lord Watson of Wyre Forest since last autumn. Tom, as I think anyone joining the call, was an MP for West Bromwich East from 2001 until 2019 when he stepped down. Government Minister during Blair and Brown administrations, and Shadow Minister for Culture, Media and Sport from 2016 to 2019. Since leaving Parliament, Tom has been Chair of UK Music, actually worked with me with setting up a COVID trade association body, and then advisor to Flutter on the issue of prop and gambling. Now, one piece of housekeeping about today's event is that I will pose some questions. We'll have a discussion for about half an hour, Tom, and then we'll invite questions from those attending. Because we're very limited on time, if you could post the questions using the Q&A button. If you want to ask a question or make a point, just post it there, and then we'll try and get through as many of those questions as possible during the interview. So, Tom, welcome.
Hi, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Hello to everyone viewing remotely.
So let's kick off. 2019, the last time people were really aware of Tom Watson in a senior role. Most people have seen you very active in politics, but then you stepped back as deputy leader of the Labour Party at that time. You've obviously been out of politics for 3 years. How I guess start by how was that? How has that been?
Well, it was not the plan I had, because obviously we had COVID. So I moved back to my home area where I grew up, Wyre Forest. I spent 3 years trying to get out of my pajamas. I published 3 books. I made 2 TV programs, one serious, one jokey, and tried not to listen to the Today program for the first 2 years. And then when I finally started to take an interest in politics as a pedestrian or as a spectator again, I tried not to turn into Victor Meldrew because I couldn't believe what was going on. And I saw all these MPs getting arrested and spent most days asking myself, did I really used to work there for 20 years? But I also set up a small business, did a bit of consultancy, became a non-exec director of a trade body, and started to learn new skills and get to know what it's like to talk to government from the outside. Began to feel sorry for all those people that came into my office when I was a minister.
And is that the biggest sort of lesson you've taken that from your work outside Parliament, that there is you're sort of wearing the other hat rather than being the person taking the meetings, you're the person trying to kind of pitch in to have the meetings with ministers or MPs?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of know how government works on the inside, which is why I've done a little bit of some of the work I've done. I mean, the first thing that really shocked me actually was how there are a lot of sectors, a lot of companies in Britain that work in regulated markets, but don't talk to government enough. And that really shocked me. I mean, if you work in health or pharmaceuticals, or you work in even the creative sector where there's a sort of telecoms element, there's so many companies out there that don't actually think it's worth the investment in public affairs or good comms until government starts to want to change things, and it has massive impacts on their company. And by the time regulation or legislation is off the tracks, very often people have missed the boat. So that shocked me. I guess just being a small business I managed to set up a company in 15 minutes, thank you, digital reforms in government. But it took me about 2 months to get a business bank account. And I couldn't, I was tearing my hair out. I thought, well, I actually want to go out and, genuinely go out and do things and employ people. And I've got no way to trade yet. So those little anecdotes,
yes.
They are informative, and they will inform the way I talk to my colleagues who may well be in government in 12 months'
Just come back to that point about businesses in regulated areas not talking to government enough. Is it just a sort of sense that they'll kind of when they'll only do it when there's a problem? It's almost like we don't need to invest up front in this. We'll simply have to wait until the problem's actually arrived, and then we'll do it.
Well, that's one element. I mean, that's what you could argue the slothful element. Actually, I think there is another thing in business. Businesses are more rational. They work on the bottom line. They think they can make a case, and they make a business case, and if it works, people will see the essential logic of that direction. Government tries to be rational, but very often isn't, is it? There are competing forces. There are different personalities. There are different ideologies. There's emotion. There's media pressure. And all those elements, to the rational business people out there who are just trying to do what they do every day, look after their staff, build their business, they sometimes can't understand why ministers don't just click their fingers because their argument is right. And that's not being dismissive, but that's kind of two immiscible liquids meeting. And I guess the art of public affairs is people bridging those two different worlds and explaining each side to each other. And that's an art form as well as a science, I think.
Because I think a lot of businesses see lobbying public affairs as just an extra cost to business. And one of the things I guess we say to a lot of our clients is, yes, there is a cost, but surely there's a way of seeing it as if you can avoid negatives, a regulation that might adversely affect your business, or positive, trying to create opportunities. That we try to say to our clients, are there making sure that what you're doing has a commercial benefit, isn't just meetings for its own sake. And I think my experience of many clients is sometimes they well, I should just go and see the minister, to which our question is, what for? What? And that, I think, is sometimes part of the problem, that there's a perception that, well, I'll just get the meeting, and that's the sort of achievement itself, rather than I've got the meeting, and the benefit of the meeting is that I can actually do something positive for my business out of it. I mean, has that been your experience, both in and outside government?
Yeah, well, when companies have got problems, I mean, very often the first question is, can't we get the minister to fix this? And actually, the response is, actually, you've got to build your case. Why is this proposal on the table? What's led to it? What's the entrails? And very often that goes back years. And who else do who are your competitors for attention in all of this? And I do, because it's a complex beast, the UK government, and it is very hard when you've got political turbulence, which we've obviously got at the moment as well. So helping people manoeuvre around that's really important. But it did shock me. And what I've noticed with bigger corporates, where they've got a properly functioning risk committee, where they're actually looking at where there are opportunity costs to inaction, they tend to be better resourced for public affairs. It's when people aren't keeping an eye out on what the potential worst case scenario is for a business, I think.
So let's go back to when you were first in Parliament, 2001. Imagine that your career was reversed. So you had done all the things you've done after leaving Parliament, and now you are a kind of fresh-ish faced candidate for the 2024, maybe 2025 election. What would you bring that you've learned from the outside Parliament, if you were just starting, if you were going to get elected a couple of years' time, and then we're going to be an MP and then potentially a minister? What kind of things would you sort of bring that would be different to back in the almost the last century?
Well, I think the thing I'd advise, I mean, I get a lot, I've talked to a lot of my Labour colleagues now. I mean, they're all, now that they're actually potentially facing being ministers, I always say when you first get your first foot on the ladder in a ministerial office, you've still got your parliamentary duties, you've got your constituency duties. There are things the department expects you to do. You've probably only got 5 to 10 hours a week where you can define your own agenda. And so I always say, find 2 or 3 issues that are minor issues and make them yours. And actually, I'm doing quite a lot of, that's where I'm talking to guys now. So I think when I was at the Cabinet Office, I realised that publicly available data could be a commercial success for government. And what we needed to do was release it to entrepreneurs that could use it. So I remember having a fight with Ordnance Survey over low-level geospatial mapping. Believe it or not, the barriers, you had to license these things. There were all sorts of cultural reasons why we didn't want to give small businesses digital mapping tools. And when you think about that, it's not a big contribution, but actually it made a difference. Set up a task force, we did this and that. So I would definitely say be very focused in the changes you want to make as a junior minister, because that builds your reputation across Whitehall. Someone that can deliver. And actually, I think the political requirements of the next government now are, they do need a government that means what it says and actually delivers on its promises. Don't want to get party political, but there is an issue about basically public trust about government, whether it can actually deliver anything these days. Well, of course it can, but it requires focus and it requires strong leadership.
Okay, let's turn to Labour. Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Shadow Cabinet seem to be making some progress ahead of the polls. But of course, we've seen with oppositions in the past, both Conservative and Labour, that can happen. You can be ahead, and then come the election, the result goes the other way. It doesn't feel like that right now. It feels as if the country has seen 13, 14 years of the Conservative government, and maybe it's time for a change. What's your sense of where we are?
Well, I wasn't sure until the local elections. I genuinely thought, I wasn't sure whether Rishi Sunak could pull it back, whether he could unpick the Liz Truss episode, whether he could define himself in the eyes of voters different to Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Sadly, and I don't think this is his fault, by the way, he's not been able to do that. And where I think he was shocked by those results, and I think what would have been a surprise to him, and it was probably a surprise to Labour people, was that the Lib Dems have made inroads into strong Tory heartlands. I think they're now challenging in every area of the southwest of England, and of course, what people forget is that was very helpful to Labour in the mid-90s when they had their big wins. And that's quite a big challenge for Rishi Sunak. I think Keir will be Prime Minister now, not certain, but I think he will be Prime Minister. Whether he has a working majority or not, I don't know. And of course, but that means we are really, the whole country feels like it's preparing itself for a transition. Voters are beginning to think about what kind of Prime Minister Keir will be and what kind of Chancellor Rachel Reeves will be. I'm a bit old school on this. I know data analysts are always top of the list to meet Prime Ministers these days, but I think there's three bits of polling data that really count. One is party identification, party who you'll vote for. One is leadership ratings, and the other is economic competency. And of those economic competencies, probably the most important in my mind. And I think Rachel Reeves has made really important milestones to show that she can be a tough Chancellor, as well as Keir being a future Prime Minister.
Because one of obviously, the current Labour leadership has to deal with the legacy of the past, and what's seen at the end of the Brown administration's kind of fiscal overreach, but also the Corbyn manifesto, which promised to spend a lot of money. I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure it was all entirely believable, and of course that's one of the kind of the problems that Labour always has to be seen. Certainly under Blair, for example, when Blair was elected, one of the things very keen to was to demonstrate, economic competence and fiscal responsibility. And it seems certainly looking at some of the steps that Labour's taken recently, as you said, led by Rachel Reeves, I thought one of the most significant, not much commented on, one of the most significant announcements was the one just last week where the £28 billion green energy plan was unceremoniously dumped, and it will be done over time rather than quickly. But that, of course, is all part of saying that we're a serious party, being ready for government. But they'll need a lot more of that, won't they, between now and the next election?
Yeah, I mean, that was actually quite a big test for Rachel Reeves, I thought. I mean, she did, that for me, that was, are we serious about government day? And actually, she proved it once again. But there will be many, many more of those. NHS waiting lists is one thing. What's your role with the market, with the private sector there? There's a whole load of challenges ahead. And give me a lucky general and all of that. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's personal conduct since he was leader has actually allowed Keir Starmer the ability to sort of differentiate himself against Jeremy Corbyn, which in those red wall seats is really, really important for Labour. And actually, I don't think he quite gets credit for that. I'm not sure if I would have taken the political risk to remove the whip from Jeremy Corbyn when Keir did. Because that faction that he ran was very, very powerful within the Labour Party when I was deputy leader. But he did it, and it's worked for him politically. And all those kind of, dare I say, faction people, hard left faction people, a lot of them have actually left the Labour Party voluntarily now. And sadly for All Green Party, a lot of them appear to have joined the Green Party.
And that, there's a saying in politics that people don't pay much attention to the day-to-day, and impressions change over time. And when there are signal moments, and famously, obviously, kind of ditching clause 4 by Blair, but it does feel to me, in hindsight, sometimes easier to see that there's something that's happened that may not have resonated hugely on the day, but over time. And I think you're right. The Corbyn thing has played out in a very positive way. It could have been seen as very divisive and led to kind of constant wrangles, as we're seeing in the Conservative Party right now. But actually, it looks like a pretty smart decision now, because, as you say, those people have departed. And then the Tories had a campaign ad recently, which, and I think the Prime Minister in question time kind of raised it, where they sort of criticised Labour for this excessive spending. But when I actually looked at apart from the 28 billion, which is now off the table, when I looked at expenditure, I thought, this seems pretty thin. I mean, it's not the Corbyn manifesto. And I think that sometimes when I observe what the Conservatives are doing, it feels like they're fighting other elections and they're trying to paint Labour as irresponsible. And the one thing that's clear is they're not. So let's come to the Starmer question then. There's a critique which is, well, he's not Blair because there's only one Tony Blair, but it does seem to be a consistent theme that although Labour leads, his leads over Rishi are not as substantial. Now, that is not untypical when a Prime Minister is matched against a leader of the opposition. As you're aware, I worked for the Conservatives in a relatively senior position when the Conservatives were in a pretty desperate place in opposition. But that's always the case. But it does seem that there's some niggling doubt. Is that something that worries you?
Well, I mean, I worry about everything, but I'm not worried about Keir's leadership. I mean, winners write history and all that. I was a young party organiser in the mid-90s. I worked at Millbank. People forget Tony inherited a John Smith poll lead of nearly 50 points. I don't want to I'll take you back to your younger days, Mark, but of course, you look what mortgage rates were back then. People were losing their homes. We're about to have 1.5 million homeowners, have their mortgages, potentially doubled in the next 6 months in the run up to an election. The people are really going to feel pain. I think with Keir, I think he already passed the first test quite easily. I think people look at him and think, yeah, he could do the job as Prime Minister. And Jeremy never passed that test, and Ed Miliband struggled to pass that test. God bless him, and I respect him greatly. So I think that's the most important thing. His second most important thing is he's got Rachel Reeves and they're a double act, and they obviously work very closely, and they're not going to fall out of the economy, which was not the case in the Blair Brown years, as everyone now knows. And I think that's really important. I think where people, he's often criticised because he's not a retail politician. He's not showy. He's not entertaining. And people always say he should do this and that. I just think that's not him. He empties his intro every day. He's got an idea what he wants to do. He takes his time to make a decision, but when he does it, he's absolutely ruthless. I think those are the qualities I think people look at a prime minister. I think more importantly, though, and actually, I'll probably get criticised from Labour for this. If you actually look at Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, I think what they represent is the country righting itself.
Right.
Business as usual of two-party politics. They know the parameters which both parties will operate. It's about an argument about where, how far you intervene in markets and how you redistribute. They're not going to frighten people and they're not going to scare people. Now, obviously, I've got a criticism about the way Rishi leads his party, and there's all sorts of things there. But I think people will just be relieved that we'll have a set of serious characters who believe in public service and want to do their best.
So elections are about choices. And to pick up on that point, one of the problems that Labour faces is, you remember that the famous note that David Cameron used to tout around, the Liam Byrne note that said there's no money left. Well, if there wasn't any money left then, post-COVID, all the other kind of post-Ukraine invasion, it's certainly there's no money now. Isn't one of the challenges there for Labour that essentially both parties are going to go into the election saying, well, the promises they're able to make, I mean, maybe it reflects what Rachel Reeves done on this green energy package, but isn't the problem that the public will be faced with two technocratic, not hugely inspiring communicators, but actually very bright people, it seems to me, both Rishi and Keir, but there's not much difference. They seem to be similar kind of people. Is that a problem for Labour, or?
I think Labour's had such a racy last 5 years that recalibrating and showing stability is really important. I mean, nobody seriously believes that Rachel Reeves is going to risk the economy. Right? She's almost been born to do this job. She's even a chess prodigy, for heaven's sake. But where I think longer term, there will be internal pressures from young ministers that want to do imaginative things with public services. And that's about party management, party discipline. And that will play out, I'm sure. I think the renewables package is a good one. It just overreached, given that the economy took a nosedive within the last 18 months. So she's right to draw that in. I think there are structural things we can do in the economy. There are 50% of young people that still don't go to university that really haven't got career paths. There's a lot of work you can do structurally with, reforming apprenticeships and stuff. And there's bodies of work around that. I think the critical thing in the next 5 years, though, is how are we going to support people with cost of living? Mortgage rates through the roof. People overreached on their mortgages. Their wages aren't going up to match inflation. That middle group of struggling families are going to be the litmus test for the election after next. And how Labour addresses that is going to be really important. They actually inherit the highest tax take in history. So if the economy starts to turn around, there will be flexibility towards the end of the next parliament, I think, to map out how you might invest some of that money into public services. The other opportunity, and this is where Labour is still working this through, is we devolved to Scotland and Wales, and that, in my view, created tensions in the English regions, and how Labour essentially allows the north of England to decide its own destiny is still being mapped out. But you can see tensions there with northern mayors, both Conservative and Labour, working together to try and make the case for taking control of how they do their own infrastructure investment. With the idea that you've got a levelling up fund in Whitehall that can decide whether it renovates Great Yarmouth Pier or not, is quite ridiculous. Those northern mayors are going to be wanting to decide where transport infrastructure goes, how you deliver health services, and that kind of stuff. And actually, Labour can spend some time on that in the next Parliament that I think will have an electoral impact in the election after that.
Just on that point, isn't what everyone was, I've been involved in drawing up manifestos myself, isn't the cry always that we need to devolve more when you're in opposition, and then when you get in government, there's this sort of temptation. I quite like having my levelling up fund that I can dole up my fund. I mean, except that, because Greg Clark, for example, a sort of colleague of mine that I worked with in the past, that was kind of his ambition, but it never seems to quite happen. They've done some things happened, and the creation of successful mayor model, I think, has been one of the things that's been going back to 20 years. It certainly helped revitalise local or city government, but it never seems to be everything. They dole up just enough, but there's still the essential control by central government.
Yeah, the inertia, the dead hand of Whitehall, dead hand of the Treasury, of course it does. And of course there's risk there as well. You give Andy Burnham a lot of money and he screws it up. He's still there's power without responsibility there. But I do think that's the only way the North is going to regenerate is taking control of its own destiny. And I think there is a will there for Labour to get this right, and they're working that through. It fills the imagination gap when you're trying to pare down the debt, and you're just wading through 2 years of misery to try and get people to keep their homes, which is where I think we're going to be in 6 months' time.
And one of the things I've been very impressed by, for both of our clients and what I hear in the wider world, is that Labour's engagement with businesses, many of whom will be on the call today, has been very impressive and deep. So it's not just getting Rachel or Keir to go to have a one-off summit, but actually it's the follow-up afterwards. They have the initial meeting with the CEOs, and then there's consistent follow-up, and actually taking account in developing policies of the ideas that are coming through from business. I mean, that again seems to be a sign of a serious party that actually understands that government has a role, but of course so does the business sector, as indeed the third sector. Is that one of the things that you're observing? You think there is a kind of has there been a shift in that?
The Shadow Cabinet have all been told that. I mean, they want export-led growth, and so they're looking for ideas and collaboration. That's the other bit of advice I give to these, nascent junior ministers, which is don't stop that in government. The first decision you've got to make in your office is, have you got an open door policy? You're going to spend time allowing people to come and talk to you. The sort of default position for a lot of the civil service is, let us talk to business for you, Minister. You don't want to be compromised by that. If you talk to X, you have to speak to Y and Z as well. Well, I would say to Labour people, talk to X, Y, and Z. Don't favour one particular business over others. Just hear the voices and expose yourself to those rational arguments that business very often puts.
What about the priorities for Labour? I mean, I guess 2 points. One, it's clear that, as you say, the cost of living crisis is going to be something that I'm afraid, isn't dealt with in the next 18 months. That clearly is going to be an issue after the next election, whoever's in power. But what other priorities do you think that Labour will have, particularly with as we've already discussed, you can't just splash the cash. There isn't anything left. So they're going to be very picky about what they prioritise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always pulled up. You can only have one priority, and that should be cost of living crisis. I mean, if I was running elections now, when I remember growing up on Harold Wilson party political broadcast, where he had, a pound of butter with a price tag on it. I mean, this is literally, people are weighing up pounds and pence in their shopping bags. Mrs. T with the purse and all of that. This is going to be a cost of living election, whether the political parties want it or not. And how Labour in government in certainly the first few years deals with that will be the mark of its, longevity. Then I think it can start those structural reforms. That's why that renewables plan is still important, even though it's been scaled back in the first half of the Parliament. I think dealing with the skills gap, from apprenticeships to in-house training to school curricula to reforming higher education. That's the way we're going to get export-led growth and get, productive capacity of the nation sorted out. And if they could land those two things beyond that in the first term of that parliament, it doesn't sound, particularly a long list of things, but it will be a very significant political input, I think.
And what about the NHS? It usually comes top of, at the moment, as you say, cost of living is at the top, but in most polling, NHS is there or thereabouts as the most kind of important public priority. But it feels as if over the last decade, probably last 20 years, there's a very significant extra investments gone into the NHS. And yet here we are with a kind of waiting list of 7 million people. Seems, listening to Wes Streeting on this, he does seem to have a more open mind about working with the private sector. I guess my question is do you think that there's an appetite? There's kind of feels like there's two strands of Labour thinking when they're working with the private sector. That what I might call the Andy Burnham approach, which is it's a kind of necessary evil, and the Wes Streeting, well, there are things we can look at the private sector, and we should certainly be looking to partner with them where we can. Where do you think the balance lies there?
I certainly think with the NHS, thank heavens for Wes Streeting. I remember Labour, when it was elected in 97, had a mini crisis because waiting lists went to 100,000. You think that, and then that actually cost the Secretary of State his job. And you ended up with John Reid and Alan Milburn coming in. And they partnered with the private sector, independent sector. They did all sorts of protocols about how terms and conditions of workers would be guaranteed, pay was guaranteed in the private sector, but they partnered it. And they brought down that waiting list to below 100,000 with an 11-week waiting time, maximum waiting time. 7 million.
Yeah.
It's enormous. They're not actually pushing that 7 million waiting list, although I'm sure in the election, the 7 million people on the waiting list will be pushing it. If Labour wants to get through its first term and significantly bring that waiting list down, it's got to have new and imaginative ways of delivering services. And the independent health sector will have a role to play in that. The independent health sector will have to talk to Labour about what it requires in terms of worker protections and how terms and conditions are guaranteed. But when you think about it, there's such a labour shortage in some of these skilled jobs anyway. They're going to be well-paid jobs anyway. Mm. I think there's an accommodation that can be made there. And I can see Wes Streeting already trying to build an alliance between public sector unions. Those conversations are going on, and they're very clever. Not without political risk, because obviously there's dogmatists out there who think that any role for anything other than state-owned apparatus in the NHS is in some kind of betrayal. I just think on day one that will, Wes Streeting will dispense with that, because the practicalities of delivering a service of this size will be upon him.
Now, coming to just a reminder for those tuning in that if you want to pose a question, please do it in the Q&A function. We've already had some questions coming in. One which kind of touches on a point that we made is, does Labour need to be clearer from a comms perspective about what it will deliver in government? At the moment, is it sort of vote for us because we're not them? I know all elections are about time for a change, but that's it. And is there people sometimes criticise, I've heard criticism of Keir Starmer's 5 missions, that they don't really cut through. And what's needed is a series of what are always called retail offers, i.e. things that the public understand. Do you think that Labour is going to need to do more, or can they just kind of wait around and just assume that things will carry on going pretty badly and therefore they'll win?
No, I think they do. It's not just comms. They have to actually have practical. Have a practical program. Now, I think they played it pretty smart, because obviously with Jeremy Hunt, who's not averse to spending taxpayers' money, unlike his predecessors. Because you look at the the nursery provision. The government did quite a big announcement on that in the budget, which was essentially assimilating the work that Bridget Phillipson had been doing as shadow education. she should be pleased with that. She's now got an extra 2.2 billion in that childcare budget. But how Labour decides its priorities, it communicates them. We get to the point where they need to start doing it now. I think they were right to hold back. They didn't know where the economy is going to land, and they didn't want the government to blunder their best policies. I know that from the next big point in time will be the annual conference. You'll be seeing a lot more of what Labour are going to practically do to implement its goals. Everyone talks about, how do you, communicating through the white noise of current politics is almost impossible for a politician. We've had 3 prime ministerial changes in a year. We've got 4 by-elections looming. So it's very hard to sort of get those messages through. But obviously, that's its political challenge, and I've no doubt they'll do it. They've been resourcing extra bringing more people in who can help do that. One of the things it's got to do is, what does it do with social media?
Right.
If I was Keir, and he will ignore me on this, by the way, and I've not advised him, I would pull all our front benches off Twitter, for example. It's white noise, and you do what Joe Biden did. Occasionally stick something out there, but don't use it as your main communication channel, like a lot of our young front benchers seem to do.
Right. Because one of the only powers that, of course, the Conservative government does have is the ability to actually take decisions. And as you said, on childcare, that was a kind of tactically smart, and whether the public really noticed is another matter. But so that is always the danger. Labour announces some big new policy, and then the Conservatives say, well, thank you so much, we'll take that and implement ourselves. But I guess in things like health service, we've got to a stage where, yes, the government can announce things and then can do things, but if Wes Streeting is going to take over, actually he does want there to have been some improvement. He doesn't want to get, first day in office, gets the briefing from officials, we're still at 7.5 million in the queue, it's November 2024, and the winter crisis is about to hit. You don't need, the first thing you want to do is not to have to do that. But there is that tension, isn't there, that you announce too much, whether too early or not, and the Conservative government, because they are in government, can do that. That will remain an issue, won't be? Unless there are things they can announce which are so anathema to the Conservatives, and then you're in the danger that they might be in Jeremy Corbyn territory, to put it delicately. Is that one of the things they're struggling with?
The counter is, how does the government communicate? There's our Prime Minister, who has a moderately successful trip to America, warm relations with Joe Biden, lays down some foundations for bilateral, economic ties in a way that had kind of, put to bed uncertainty. And can anyone remember that Rishi Sunak was in Washington last week? No, they can't, because we've got a former Prime Minister who's created a by-election. The turmoil of that is as equally challenging for incumbency as it is for us insurgents. It must be bewildering for people who are just trying to run their businesses and trying to just think, I want a rational conversation with government and opposition. And I guess that's why you do the work you do, Mark, because that needs interpretation. You'd have to spend 100 hours a month trying to work out what the sort of entrails of all these rows going on across Parliament are at the moment.
And sometimes that's just about trying to block out the noise and say this, but you want to have a meeting with this minister about this topic. Don't worry about the kind of noises off that dominate the headlines. You touched on the by-elections, and obviously there are people talking about the 3 by-elections, but of course there are 4 by-elections.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways we were discussing beforehand that the most significant might not be the 3 that are in the headlines, but the one where Labour is up against the SNP in Rutherglen.
In Rutherglen, yeah, where there will be likely to be a trigger election. And that could mean potentially Labour winning a seat from the SNP a year before a general election, which could significantly impact on the electoral landscape of Scotland. And 2 years ago, the idea that Labour would make any gains in Scotland, no one was really predicting that. Now events have unfolded north of the border, both with the economy and with the the investigation into the SNP, that means I think Labour is at the races there. And if you were Keir Starmer, and I was looking at where I would send my, best volunteer campaigners, I would want them in Glasgow Rutherglen in the next 3 months. I went up there in the recess to go and support Anas Sarwar, and was really, just the energy in the Scottish Labour Party. It's like when I was first elected, and I'm not trying to undermine my colleagues, but it's been pretty. There's been pretty desperate in the Scottish Labour Party for a few years. There's a real buzz now. And of course, the outcome of that by-election is not just for the next general election, it could impact on the future of the union as well. So that to me is the most important by-election this side of the summer.
Because in a way, Starmer needs 120, 130 seats. And the reason it's seen as an uphill task is precisely because the last time Labour were in government, they had many, many more seats in Scotland. Of course, if they were able to win not just Rutherglen, but 20, 30 or whatever seats, and it's easy to forget that it's not just the Conservative government that have been in power for the last 13 years, but the SNP have been in government for even longer in Scotland. Yeah. And certainly with the shenanigans, put it delicately, about Nicola Sturgeon, then it's easy to imagine the people deciding that we're time for a change here as well. Could just come on to one of the other questions that's come through. There's two questions on the same issue. What do you think about, it's a sensitive subject, but what do you think about Labour's relationship with the EU and indeed other countries and blocs? Is there going to be a proactive approach to securing trade deals?
I think there's going to have to be. And I think Jonathan Reynolds I think he gets this. With the EU, first of all, with the people that negotiate on behalf of the EU, there is a rebuilding of trust. I know it sounds quite ridiculous, but the idea that you'd have to reassure them that when we sign an international treaty that is a legally binding agreement, we will stick to a legally binding agreement. That's how far back we are in that trust relationship. And I suspect they know that a Labour government will do that and will not, sign off a treaty for a short-term political gain. That's not to say there's going to be difficulty ahead. I think there's huge opportunity for, we're still going to be doing some of these bilateral trade deals beyond the next election. How you resource your soft power institutions, like, from the British Council to, UK T&I. I think Labour can do quite a bit on that. Whenever I used to do international visits as a minister, if you go to the Middle East and you talk to the expat community looking for, trying to help outreach from UK companies, they would always say, well, the French ambassadors always invited the rivals to meet ministers and stuff. We could definitely reform how our embassies, treat the business community and make them more responsive. There's a whole load of work that could be done there, both in the EU and further afield.
One question, certainly left field question, is how will Labour approach the restoration of devolution instalment and the whole issue of the issues in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, okay. Well, that, one would hope that the broad way cross-party consensus or opposition support governments in dealing with this sensitive subject, one would hope that we could get to the election where installment is actually resolved itself before an election. I think we've just got to say to the unionist community, you've got to step up and show leadership here. We know it's difficult, but it's tricky. It is a tricky road ahead. Sinn Féin leading the polls in North and South is a challenge for everyone. But unionism needs a voice in an elected chamber. And I think Labour, with the best will in the world, getting everyone back round the table to try and sort that will be key. I speak to a lot of Ulster Unionist veterans of the Commons who are in the Lords with me. And I know how hard it is for them. I'm not saying how difficult it is, but sooner or later we've got to get everyone around the table. Now, there was always a complaint when David Cameron was Prime Minister from my Ulster Union colleagues that he would never give enough time to sort out the little problems before they became big problems. And I just think for any Prime Minister, whether it's Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, making sure that Northern Ireland doesn't go backwards is obviously key to their agenda. We've had the 25th anniversary of the agreement. There's all sorts of documentaries. It's a very fragile piece, and that requires leadership and time. And I'm sure both leaders understand that.
We're coming towards the end, and two final questions. One about tactical voting. And obviously parties can't encourage tactical voting in reality because it means encouraging someone to vote for somebody other than you. But is there, with the 4 by-elections coming up, there certainly are somewhere, there's one where the Lib Dems maybe have a better chance. I know they were in 3rd place, for example, in Mid Beds. But can there be a tacit support for tactical voting by simply not, as you said, putting your troops in the other places?
I'm laughing because when I was a junior, I was a teenager at Labour HQ. And I remember basically Labour closed down a magazine called New Socialist because the then editor Stuart Weir suggested tactical voting to keep the Tories out, as he said in those days. And it's like a chestnut. The thing is, parties don't need to say anything on this now because people self-organise on their websites and whatever. I guess, again, electoral luck means that in those seats that really count at the next election, 9 out of 10 of them that the Lib Dems are challenging in are against the Conservatives. I'm not. The last time I checked, tactical voting exists in those seats where people know kicking an incumbent party out can make a difference.
Because it happened in the locals, and it was very clear that people kind of worked out. No, it's a smaller turnover. People worked out where the party most likely to be the Conservatives. It was about Conservatives or the other. They worked out where it's most likely that an opposition party could win.
Yeah, although let me give the Lib Dems more credit for those. I mean, they got 20% of the popular vote. And, to a certain extent, that was a lot of Conservative voters sending a signal or not doing the complete journey to Labour. I don't want to, but I don't want to undermine the Lib Dems. Some of it was people saying, we're going to go Lib Dem. Now, I don't think they'll get, in fact, I know they won't get 20% of the popular vote at the next election. But I think it does mean that Rishi Sunak will have to retrench. You either win field organisation, which we know can have plus or minus 2%. It's at the margins, but a plus 2% in those key seats really matters. They're going to have to be moving resource into defensive marginal seats against the Lib Dems that they had not factored in 2019. And that gives Labour greater opportunity in those red wall seats. Again, although I think many of the red wall seats are pretty much back with Labour already. In the end, the battleground is still those kind of suburban seats, what I would call the 97 key seat list, where, decent hard-working people earning decent money, wanting to keep their homes and give their kids a decent education, really think about how they vote. And that's Labour's challenge, and it should stick to its game. Trying to do tactical deals with other parties never works, I think. And the Lib Dems are ploughing their own furrow. They've been harmed by their period in coalition. They'll do their thing. Labour will do its thing. If Labour can't get the numbers, I think there is zero chance of there being a coalition government after the election. It may be the Lib Dems give some kind of support from the opposition benches, but that's a negotiation after an election.
Just one reflection. If you think back over 20, 30 years, there have been shifts in public opinion towards the role of government. In the 1980s, tended to be smaller government. Through 1990s, 2000, shift back. But is what's happened in COVID, and then specifically the government support through furlough during COVID, and then subsequently with the energy support packages, has that encouraged the sense that government does have a big role to play, and therefore kind of underpins the belief that actually maybe a responsible Labour Party is more in tune with where the public is now?
I think what all political leaders need to know is that when people's way of lives are under threat, government needs the capacity to act and act decisively. It wasn't just COVID, it was actually the 2008 world crisis, where we happened to have had a Prime Minister who'd read Ben Bernanke's PhD thesis 30 years before on the 1930s depression and realised speed and massive intervention was what would save the global economy. Same with COVID. We didn't know we were going to get a vaccine that would save hundreds of thousands of lives, but we knew that if we slowed the transmission down in the early weeks, it would save many lives. And so I think what they want is a government that can act when markets fail or when the way of life is under threat, be that a security threat or a health threat. And I mean, the good news beyond all the party politics is I think both party leaders get that. I think Ed Davey gets that. The row will be how far you intervene, what priority services you deliver, and how you the timeline you do it. To me, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Just one final reflection on that. Do you think, having been inside government, having been in opposition, do you think that governments are well set up to deal with the unforeseen? You look at the initial reaction to COVID, what happened with the energy support package. Sometimes you can think, well, lots of good things did happen. Yeah. But is government just too... Unlike say companies, there's a crisis affect a company. Often you can see that very swift, even the largest company, very swift action to address it. Is government really set up to be able to deal with these sorts of things?
Well, I think when you say government, you mean the apparatus of government, including civil service. Well, I think there does need to be a piece of civil service reform. I'm actually an admirer of the work that the government are doing on this now. Francis Maud, with his independent review, I think is drawing on the frustrations that sort of Labour ministers had in the 90s, as well as Conservative ministers, the sensible ones. And he's trying to talk to civil servants about how a responsive civil service, more agile civil service might operate. And if you can get that culture change, beating up on civil servants is never a good thing. But taking them on a process of change is going to be challenging. And government's, statecraft is still a requirement of public life and public office, and how you represent your nation and how you could sort of predict what kind of nation we want to be in a quarter of a century, as well as 2.5 weeks away. It is a requirement of, our political leaders. How you paint a picture, a vision for the country to voters who are going to put their faith in you, that matters. And government can do that. And so, yes, government is equipped to do it. But, how do you do it in the modern context? We've not even talked about AI, quantum computing, new paradigm shifts in all of that. That's on us now, isn't it? And political leaders both of them are trying to answer that today.
Yeah, and of course one day AI will replace us. So look, thank you very much, Tom. That was an amazing sort of walkthrough, and I'm particularly fascinated by your kind of reflections of the lessons that you've learned having been outside Parliament. Thank you so much for your time today. I think obviously that if there does turn out to be a Labour government, I think they could certainly do worse than think about approaching you to get their help. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Mark.